Before I begin, I'd just like to say that although I'm about to discuss some troubling events from my past, please keep in mind, my story is a happy ending. I have my health, a wonderful spouse, and a great job, and no one should expect more than that from life. I've only been working at my current job with Molly Kenny's office since last August, but it already feels like home. It's great to work with a team of high-functioning professionals who always have your back. And it's also great to work with people who know the worst things about your past, but still like you anyway. That's huge. I'm very lucky to be where I am today. For a long time, it did not look like it was going to happen because there was a lot working against me. In 1997 to 2001, I was a methamphetamine addict. I also have a criminal history, 4 felony convictions for delivery of amphetamines from a 1999 arrest. I have a prison record. I spent 2 years in the Washington State prison system from 2002 to 2004. I was suspended from the practice of law in 2000, officially disbarred in 2004, and didn't get my law license back till 2010. And even then, I didn't start practicing law again in Washington until 2013. And when I returned to Washington in 2013, my AVO rating was a 4.4 extreme caution. And when I first got back to Seattle, if you Googled my name, all you saw was page after page of stories about my arrest, conviction, and disbarment. And on top of that, I'm gay. And while I understand that's not a big problem in Seattle in 2017, it certainly was a big deal growing up in New Jersey in the 60s and 70s. And it was also kind of a big deal back in North Carolina, where I just moved from, a state where you can be fired just for being gay. Now, throughout our presentations today, you'll be asked to take part in a number of instant polls. No one's going to know how you answered the poll questions, so please be as candid as possible. Let's take our first instant poll. Based on your experience, which of the following stigmas would most negatively affect a lawyer's career? Press 1 for being openly gay, 2 for having a felony record, 3 for having spent time in prison, 4 for having been disbarred and reinstated, 5 having a history of meth addiction, or 6 having an AVO rating of 4.4. Go ahead and make your selections, and at the end of my presentation, we'll discuss the results. Now, many of you may already know my story from Northwest Lawyer magazine, or you may have heard me speak before, or some of you may have actually been around when it happened. If you don't know my story already, I'm going to give you a much abbreviated version, which is necessary to give you context for the rest of my presentation. After graduating law school in 1988, I became an assistant district attorney in New York City, where I specialized in sex crimes prosecutions. In 1995, I moved from New York to Seattle and started work in the King County Prosecutor's Office. During the first 9 years of my career as a prosecutor, I was a trial attorney. Trial work comes very naturally to me, but I find it all-consuming. And at that point in time, most of my evenings were spent getting ready for trial the next day or preparing for the next trial coming up. But in 1997, all that changed when I was made a district court supervisor at the prosecutor's office, a job that actually ended at the end of the workday. With no more cases to try, for the first time in my career, my nights were my own to do with as I pleased. I thought it was a perfect time to go out and meet a partner. But as a gay man in my mid-30s, there was a limited number of places I could go to meet other gay men. Remember, this is before cell phones, before the internet, before Tinder or Grindr, and before gay marriage was even on the horizon. In 1997, if you wanted to meet a gay man, you had to go to a gay bar. What I failed to appreciate at the time was that in 1997, methamphetamine seemed to be everywhere in Seattle's gay bar scene, a drug to which I would soon become addicted. I knew next to nothing about meth when I tried it, but I knew it was wrong, and I agree that being a prosecutor at the time made it much, much worse. But unfortunately, I fell in love with someone who was much more experienced with drugs than I was, and eventually I did meth with him, and I loved it. I immediately became addicted, and within 6 months, I lost my job as a prosecutor when drugs were found in my briefcase at work. Even then, I was unable to stop using meth, and when my addiction made it impossible for me to continue working as an attorney, I sold meth to support my habit, and that's how I got arrested. I was tried, convicted, and sent to prison for 2 years on drug charges. When I got out of prison in September of 2004, I moved to the small, coastal North Carolina city of Wilmington to be near my family. And although I knew I had been suspended from law since 2000, just 2 days after my release from prison, I found out I had been officially disbarred. That's the short version of what happened. You can read the longer version in your written materials. Today's CLE is about resisting and overcoming personal stigmas while pursuing your legal career. And now that I've told you a little about my past, I think you understand why they asked me to speak to you today. So to set the stage, my story today begins 13 years ago in 2004, shortly after being released from prison. I was a 42-year-old, disbarred, gay, ex-convict on parole with 4 felony drug convictions for dealing meth, living in exile from Seattle in a double-wide trailer in Wilmington, North Carolina. Now, for the record, I am not disparaging double-wide trailers. A basic double-wide has 3 bedrooms, 2 bathrooms, a big living room with a fireplace, and an eat-in kitchen. And when you just spent the last 2 years of your life sharing a dorm room with 31 other men, living in a double-wide, it was like living in a palace. It might not have been ideal, but it was so much better than where I had been living. I felt spoiled. And that's actually one of my themes of my talk today. Stigmas like drug addiction or having a criminal record or having been disbarred can and will limit your options in life, but they can't eliminate your options. And when you're trying to overcome stigmas, it's better to focus on what you can achieve instead of focusing on what you think you can achieve. If you can just do that one little trick, I promise you'll get much farther than you expect. I went from that double-wide trailer in Wilmington to a mid-century modern in Bellevue, but that didn't happen overnight. It took 13 years of pretty dedicated effort, but it did happen. Now, how did I get here from there? Well, first, I didn't try to make it happen too quickly. Secondly, I didn't give up. But third, and most importantly, I got a lot of help from other people along the way. Help from friends, family members, coworkers, my husband, therapists, business coaches, bosses and support staff, cellmates, prosecutors, criminals, defense attorneys, and a lot of other addicts. I would not be here today speaking with you without their help. During every step of my 13-year journey from Wilmington to Bellevue, I was helped by other people who made it possible. The hardest part for me along the way was learning how to ask those people for help. Apparently I, like many lawyers, do not like to ask for help. I think it makes me look weak or stupid or incompetent. But I've learned the hard way that not asking for help when you really need it is the worst kind of incompetence. And letting your ego prevent you from getting help when you need it most is not only irresponsible, it usually makes your problems much worse because it leaves you isolated and feeling hopeless. I know exactly how that feels. If only I had asked for help when I first realized I was becoming addicted to meth, I never would have been arrested, convicted, imprisoned, or disbarred. But I was too afraid of the stigma attached to meth to ask for help. And once I was fully addicted to meth, there was another psychological roadblock that made recovering from my addiction even harder: my limiting beliefs. A limiting belief is a belief that stops you from accomplishing something you might otherwise be able to accomplish were it not for the limiting belief. We all have limiting beliefs. Anytime you say, I'm too old to meet the right person, that's a limiting belief. Or when you say, I can't lose weight, why try? That's a limiting belief. Most recovered meth addicts understand the concept of the limiting belief on a very personal level. Because when you're addicted to a drug as addictive as meth, you become convinced that you'll never be able to stop using it. And if you sincerely believe you'll never be able to stop using a drug, chances are you won't stop using it. Now, during the years of my addiction, I watched many people die because they did not believe that recovery from meth was possible. Recovery from meth is possible. In fact, most people who get addicted to meth eventually stop using it. Only the average length of a meth addiction is 13 years. And the problem is, by the time they're finished using the meth, they no longer have any teeth, and many have permanent brain damage. So why don't meth addicts believe they can quit using? What is the source of their limiting belief? Well, as I said, with meth, a lot of it has to do with stigma and shame. I know many recovered meth addicts, but most of them keep their former addictions a secret, and for good reason. Nothing good usually comes from telling people you were once addicted to meth. The stigma is just too intense. As a result, there are very few, if any, public role models for meth recovery. Tell me 5 famous people who openly admit they're recovered meth addicts. I can think of Fergie from the Black Eyed Peas, and I had to Google it. And while I found a long list of celebrities who said they had used meth, I didn't find anybody on that list who could be considered a role model of recovery from meth addiction. Now imagine you're a meth addict who has never heard of anyone recovering from meth addiction, and you think to yourself, how can I recover if no one else has? That's how a limiting belief gets planted in your brain, and once there, it will stop you from recovering. Because you have to believe in recovery before it's possible. Whether you're religious or not, you need at least that much faith to recover. Now, in my experience, I found the best way to get rid of a limiting belief is to talk to other people who have overcome the same problem. That's one of the reasons 12-step programs work. You go to meetings where you listen to other people describe how they overcame their addictions, and over time you come to believe you can overcome yours. It's not rocket science, it's common sense, but it's a very humbling experience, which is why lawyers don't like to do it. And that's unfortunate, because lawyers are twice as likely to become addicts as members of the general population. When you have to overcome other kinds of career-limiting stigmas, the same rules apply. You often have to ask for help from other people who understand the problem to get past it, and often those people had the same problem at some point. Now, back in 2004, I was brimming with a number of limiting beliefs about my future. I'd never have a good job again, I'd never get my law license back, I'd never be in a decent relationship, I'd never live in a nice house, and I'd never be able to stay off meth. None of those beliefs were irrational, but every one of them turned out to be untrue. I just didn't know it yet. I was too hopeless and isolated. But despite my feelings of hopelessness, after prison, I knew I had to find some way to earn a living, and fast, because my parole officer insisted. He said I had to get a job immediately. I'm glad he was such a hard ass, because without him, I probably would have wallowed in self-pity for a few months doing nothing. And by forcing me to get a job right away, he made me swallow what was left of my pride and take action. So I started calling friends from law school, people I hadn't spoken to in over 10 years, but I knew some of them had business contacts in North Carolina who might be able to help. My first call was to my friend Claire, who worked for the governor in Rhode Island. She put me in touch with our friend Karen, who taught at UVA Law School. Karen put me in touch with our friend Mary, who worked for a law firm in Charlotte. Those phone calls were very difficult. It's hard to bare your soul to somebody you haven't spoken to in a decade, then ask them for a favor, but fortunately, I had no choice. When I made those calls, I expected a lot of judgment and doubt coming back at me, and I was relieved to find out I was wrong. They all seemed genuinely concerned and wanted to help. And after talking to Mary for an hour, she sent out an email blast to firms across North Carolina vouching for me and asking if anyone knew a law firm in Wilmington that was looking for support staff who might consider hiring somebody in my situation. 2 days later, I got a job at a firm as a legal secretary and paralegal, a job I did for the next 8.5 years. Without Mary, I would never have gotten over that first stigma hurdle. Now, once the partner I worked for at the firm saw what kind of legal work I was capable of, he became convinced I could get my law license back in Washington. I thought he was incredibly naive. I mean, seriously, I had 4 felony convictions, a history of meth addiction, and a prison record. But my boss, Joel, did not subscribe to my limiting beliefs. He told me he would pay whatever costs were associated with the reinstatement process if I would just try to get my license back. And it was an incredibly generous offer because there were many costs, thousands of dollars I did not have. Had it not been for Joel Ryan, the cost of becoming an attorney again would have prevented me from even trying. When I finally got up the nerve to call the WSBA to find out if reinstatement was even possible, the receptionist put me straight through to Bob Weldon, who was bar counsel at the time. Bob knew exactly who I was and remembered everything about my case. I remember telling Bob during that conversation that I didn't expect to get my license back. I just wanted to know when I would be eligible to try. Again, I was expecting a lot of judgment and doubt during that phone call. But instead, after talking to me about my situation for a while, Bob told me not only could I reapply right away, but he also thought I was a good candidate for reinstatement and that I should try. A few days later, Bob emailed me a draft of a reinstatement brief he had been working on that laid out all the rules, issues, and case law I needed to be familiar with. I only made that first call to the WSBA so I could tell my boss, Joel, that reinstatement was impossible. But after talking to Bob and getting that brief, the first cracks started appearing in my limiting belief that I could never be a lawyer again. That was a very important moment in my journey. Receiving help from someone I didn't even know was not something I thought could happen, yet there it was. And while I'm not a religious person, it certainly felt like someone, somewhere, was sending me a message. Now, despite Joel's willingness to pay my expenses to get reinstated, I knew that did not include the cost of hiring an attorney. And I knew on my salary, I would never be able to afford the retainers I was being quoted. That was not a limiting belief. That was a financial reality. I understood if I was going to get reinstated, I was going to have to represent myself at my hearing before the Character and Fitness Committee. And I knew if I was going to have any chance of making it through that hearing, I was going to have to prove I was committed not only to my own recovery, but also to helping other lawyers recover as well. And it was going to take a lot more than my word alone. So I got involved with the North Carolina State Bar's Lawyers Assistance Program, and they introduced me to other lawyers in Wilmington who had experienced addiction. They all met for lunch twice a week at a local restaurant for what were essentially 12-step meetings. Those lawyers were instrumental in helping me break through more of my limiting beliefs. They were living examples of recovery, and by sharing their stories, they convinced me that I too could live the rest of my life without using meth. And when the time came to start submitting letters of support to the Character and Fitness Committee, many of those lawyers were there to write them. That was great. But I knew with my past I was going to need a lot more than just letters from other lawyers in recovery to meet my burden of proof. I was going to need a lot more help. That's when I started contacting lawyers I had worked with during my career to ask them to also write letters on my behalf. That was also a very humbling experience. First, I had to email each one of them and tell them the whole story, then follow it up with a phone call where I asked them to help me. They were very difficult calls. But in the end, not only did I have their unqualified support, most of those lawyers are now my Facebook friends, and several have come to visit me. Had I not asked for their help, I would never have prevailed at my reinstatement hearing, and those lawyers would never have found their way back into my life. In total, I must have asked over 60 people to help me get reinstated. Very, very few of them said no, and among those that said yes, the vast majority told me it made them feel great to be able to help. And with their help, I won my hearing. In 2010, 11 years after my arrest, 10 years after my license was suspended, and 6 years after I got out of prison, I finally got my law license back. But as you see, I could never have done it alone. I stayed in North Carolina for 3 more years after getting my license back and continued to work as a paralegal. I was in no hurry to start practicing law again in Washington. Despite getting my license back, I still had a lot of limiting beliefs about ever getting a decent job as a lawyer. It was during those last 3 years in North Carolina that I met my husband, Michael. In 2012, we flew to New York City and we got married because it was still illegal in North Carolina at the time. And over the next year, as we watched the politics of North Carolina become increasingly homophobic, we decided to leave and move back to Seattle. As I'm sure you can imagine, when I got back to Washington to restart my legal career, I was not exactly what you would call employable. Yet, here I am 4 years later with a great job in a beautiful office doing work I enjoy. Now, how did I do it? Well, a lot of it had to do with growing up gay. Now, what do I mean by that? I mean, overcoming the stigma of being gay while growing up and starting my legal career was excellent training in overcoming other stigmas later in my life. Let me explain what I mean by that. I was born in 1962 and raised in northern New Jersey, and where I grew up, everybody was white, Republican, and Christian. Not that there's anything wrong with that. It was just a very conservative place to grow up. And when I turned 8, I remember telling my brother Bill that I liked one of the older boys in Cub Scouts. And when he asked me what I meant by that, I told him I was thinking about kissing the boy. And even though I was only 8, my brother's response is still one of the most vivid memories in my life. He told me, "Don't do that. That's a really bad thing to think. Don't ever tell anybody what you just told me." Now, I worshiped Bill. He was 3 years older than me, and growing up, he taught me everything. He was the person I went to for protection when I was being bullied, and he was my closest friend and my role model. The tone in his voice when he said that to me was not one of anger. It was one of deep concern for what would happen to me if I didn't follow his advice. My entire life changed at that moment, because that was the moment I understood what stigma was and how painful it could be. And though my feelings for boys continued, I did not speak of them again until I was 20. But that didn't stop the stigma of being gay from haunting my adolescent life, because even though I wasn't openly gay in high school, I was obviously gay. I was the kid in the school musical instead of playing on the soccer team. I took choir instead of woodshop. I liked to dance. I had a high voice, big hair, and all my friends were girls. That did not go unnoticed by the other boys. And back in the 60s and 70s, boys who acted like I did were moving targets in public school. We were routinely bullied by the other boys who faced few, if any, consequences for their actions. Being gay not only made me a continuous assault victim, it separated me from my family, especially my parents. I couldn't turn to them for help because having a gay son was not an option back then, and I knew it. My parents just didn't have the knowledge or tools to deal with it themselves, let alone help me deal with it. And there were also no role models in the media for gay kids back then. There was no Rachel Maddow or Ellen DeGeneres or Anderson Cooper. There was no one. As a result, I had no idea there were other gay people like me in the world. And remember, back then, gay sex was still a crime in many states and continued to be until Lawrence versus Texas decision in 2003. I was lucky when I got to college to find a group of strong, free-thinking gay people who changed all that for me. By their example, I became convinced I was just as good and deserving as any of my 3 heterosexual brothers. Those gay students also taught me very important lessons about justice, or more appropriately, injustice, not just for gay people, but for anyone who is unfairly stigmatized. Those gay students made a huge difference in the way I saw myself. And by the end of college, I could honestly say I felt lucky to be gay. Because despite of everything that happened to me because I was gay, the political oppression, the fear of catching AIDS, the gay bashings, the taunts, the insults, the jobs I lost, it was all worth it in my mind because of the insight it gave me into the human condition. But I couldn't have gotten to that point alone. It was the people around me who helped get me there. After college, I applied to Duke Law School. And when I got the application, I saw that Duke had recently added a clause to their application saying they no longer discriminated on the basis of sexual orientation. Now, Duke is a conservative school in the heart of North Carolina. I strongly suspected that despite the new clause, very few openly gay people were applying to Duke Law School. And with that in mind, I outed myself in my application by writing my essay about how I agreed with Duke that my being gay shouldn't be a factor in my being admitted. It was not a brave thing to do. It was a cold, calculated decision on my part to improve my chances at getting in by having myself labeled a minority. As a white Anglo-Saxon Protestant male, I knew I would not stand out in the huge stack of applications Duke received every year for the 120 slots in the first-year class. I wagered, as likely the only openly gay applicant in 1985, it would improve my chances, and I was right. Although I think I would have gotten into Duke eventually, with my GPA and LSATs, I probably would have gone to the wait list first. But I wasn't. I got picked up on the first sweep of acceptances. That was a life-changing lesson for me. It was the first time I realized I could use being gay to my advantage. Now, when I graduated from law school in 1988, my first job was as an assistant district attorney in the Sex Crimes Bureau of the Brooklyn DA's office. And I'd like to say I got that job as an openly gay applicant, but that would be a lie. I kept my sexual orientation a secret during the application process because I was pretty sure it would stop me from getting the job. But once I started working there, I came out right away. And when I started in August of 1988, I was one of 2 openly gay prosecutors in an office of 400 attorneys. Now, there were, of course, many more gay people who were there who were closeted. But back then, the culture in that office was not particularly welcoming to gay people. I remember one senior prosecutor in particular who took issue with me being gay. He actually told my supervisor it was an embarrassment having somebody like me on his team. And when she asked him what he meant, he didn't mince words. He said straight out it was because I was gay and for no other reason. And back then, you could still get away with that in a New York City government job and face no serious consequences to your career. Now, despite that experience and others like it, I loved working in that office. The supervisors were very experienced trial lawyers, and one of the first trial skills they taught us was how to flip a narrative. Or, put another way, how correctly packaged, all the weaknesses in your case can be strengths. Now, that idea really came home when I watched my first homicide trial. It was a one-witness case. The defense attorney got up and argued that the state couldn't meet its burden of proof of beyond a reasonable doubt through the testimony of only one witness who saw the murder through a dirty kitchen window from across the street. It's a standard and often very effective line of reasoning used by attorneys in many criminal trials with one witness. And I remember in closing argument, the prosecutor addressing the problem this way. Ladies and gentlemen of the jury, I think we can all agree that when someone commits a crime, it's usually their conscious aim and objective to commit that crime when no one is watching. That's sort of the whole point. Only this time, this criminal made a mistake. He didn't count on a retired school teacher living right across the street and looking out her kitchen window and seeing him as he killed the victim. Remember, in most homicide cases, the only eyewitness is dead because it is the victim. At least that's how smart criminals do it. In this case, however, we have a living eyewitness, and that eyewitness came in, took an oath to tell the truth, and identified the defendant as the murderer. Now, that prosecutor took the same story and told it from a different perspective. And in doing so, he took what was clearly a weakness in his case, having only one witness, repackaged it, and made it a strength. He flipped that narrative. Now, instead of one witness being a serious lack of evidence, having one witness seemed like a whole lot of evidence. You need to approach your stigmas the same way. You need to find a way to repackage your stigma and make it an asset instead of a liability. I took that message to heart, not only in the courtroom, but in life, and after 4 years in the Brooklyn DA's office, I applied for a new job at the Queens DA's office. Only when I applied for this job, I did not hide the fact that I was gay. Instead, I explained at my interview that being gay made me more attuned to what victims go through, especially sex crimes victims, whose allegations were often disbelieved because they did not conform to a traditional idea of appropriate gender behavior, like a sexually promiscuous woman who gets date raped. There was a time when a prosecutor's office would not prosecute that case, even though the woman's private sexual behavior had nothing to do with her rape allegation. I told my interviewer, as a gay man, I understood why that was so wrong, because I understood what it meant to be wrongly discriminated against because of your private sexual conduct. By approaching the problem that way, I took what might have been a weakness in my resume, being gay, repackaged it, and made it a strength. And I didn't just get the job in Queens. They made me a supervisor in the Sex Crimes Bureau and appointed me as the district attorney's liaison to the lesbian and gay community. Now, when I got back to Seattle 4 years ago, being gay was not one of my issues. The stigmas I struggled with were my history of meth addiction, my criminal record, my prison sentence, and having been disbarred. My internet reputation was crap, and my AVO rating was worse. But there was one job I thought I had the perfect resume for, being a public defender. I love public service. The first 10 years of my career had been in public service, albeit as a prosecutor. I had a vast amount of trial experience in criminal law. I could also honestly say that no other attorney in Washington state had the depth and breadth of personal experience in the criminal justice system that I had. I could personally identify with what clients go through, and I could speak with authority to what happens in prison. And for better or worse, for a 55-year-old attorney, I have mad street cred. As a public defender, I could use everything that happened to me and turn it into a benefit for my clients. So I applied to all 4 public defender agencies in Seattle, but only one would meet with me, for which I am deeply grateful. Being asked to be interviewed by anybody at that point in my career was a very affirming experience. I thought the interview went great. I spoke with the supervisor and the director, and they seemed genuinely enthusiastic about me working there. They asked me if I was willing to do a 10-week unpaid internship first, and I said yes. And they said, great, we'll just call your references and we'll get you set up. I called all of my references that night and told them to be ready because it was finally happening. And about a week later, they started calling me back and asking why they had never been contacted. I told them I had no idea. So I started calling and emailing the people I interviewed with, but no one would take my calls or respond to my emails. By the 3rd or 4th try, I began to realize not only had they changed their minds, they were never going to tell me why. And that was the worst part. Because when you live under a cloud of stigma, it's often the silence of others that cuts the deepest, like you're not even worth responding to. It took me quite some time to get over that. Fortunately, my husband has his master's degree in psychology and spent years as a psychotherapist. Every lawyer should marry a psychotherapist. It's an amazing resource to have at home. It's better than a home gym. Michael knew how much that job meant to me, and he feared I was at risk of sliding down a rabbit hole of depression, but he would not let me give up on myself. He knew I needed to keep my mind occupied, so he forced me to come up with a new plan. He asked me what other kind of law I would consider practicing if I couldn't practice criminal law, and the only other thing I could think of was family law. The problem was I had never practiced family law, and I didn't know enough to get started. And that's when I found out about the King County Bar Association's Family Law Mentor Program, which provides direct representation to low-income women when their children are at risk because of domestic violence. The cases are given to volunteer attorneys new to family law who are trained by a mentor who is a seasoned family law professional. Not only was it a worthy cause, you also got a free crash course in family law, you got to know an established family law attorney, and you got excellent supervision. I can't recommend this program enough. It changed my life and my career. My mentor was a well-respected family law attorney from a top firm. She was a great teacher, and she's still somebody I turn to for advice. Another perk of taking part in the program is you get to attend all the CLEs sponsored by the King County Bar Association for free. And I was way behind on my credits, so I started filling up my free time by going to as many of those CLEs as I could. And it was at one of those CLEs that I sat next to a solo family law practitioner named David Huber and his beautiful wife, Joy. We discovered we were all from New York and hit it off immediately. David became a mentor for me, and it was David who told me about another well-regarded family law attorney on Mercer Island who was looking for someone to fill in for her paralegal who had just had a baby. By now, it's October of 2013. I've been back in Seattle for about 5 months at that point, and my husband and I were quickly running out of financial resources. I also knew at that point I didn't know nearly enough about family law to start practicing it on my own. So I begged for that paralegal job. I didn't even get it the first time I applied. I was passed over, and it wasn't until a few weeks later when I bumped into the same lawyer at another CLE that I finally got it. And over the next 4 months, that lawyer taught me a lot about high-conflict divorce. It turns out it's a very complicated field of law, both emotionally and intellectually. She definitely knew her stuff, and she was happy to share her knowledge with me. It was an amazing opportunity, and I'm so grateful to her for it. Thank you, Sue Tamblyn, for helping me when I needed help the most. I will never forget what you did for me. And it wasn't just Sue Tamblyn who helped me. Her husband, George Tamblyn, who I also got to know, was the person who finally taught me I could elevate my AVO score by adding to my resume and getting other attorneys to endorse me. I took his advice, and sure enough, my AVO score started creeping up from the dreaded 4.4 extreme caution to the 5.5 extreme caution, but at least it was improving. But my online reputation didn't stop with AVO. When I Googled my name, it seemed like the whole internet was against me. Yes, I had started my own website, which came up on Google searches, but that barely made a dent in the negative stories that appeared. I knew I had to do something to flip that narrative about what happened to me by telling my story from my perspective. I just wasn't sure how to do it yet. Now, fortunately, I was also volunteering with the WSBA's Lawyers Assistance Program at the time. Michael Badger and Dan Crystal, who ran LAP, convinced me I should present a CLE with Andy Benjamin on addiction, recovery, and mental health in the legal community. My part of the presentation would be telling my story of addiction and recovery. I didn't think a lot about it at the time, but in retrospect, agreeing to do that CLE is when things really started to turn around for me. Over 2,000 people signed up to see it online, and the room where we presented it was also packed. I had no idea when I agreed to do it there would be so much interest. Then Jennifer Oligario, the communications director at the bar, said she wanted me to write an article for Northwest Lawyer magazine about my experiences with addiction and recovery. The article came out in June of 2014, and you have a copy in your written materials. June of 2014 was the pivotal month for getting my career back on track. I had been back in Seattle for a year at that point. I had stopped working at Sue Tamblyn's office as a paralegal in February and started doing contract family law work with David Huber while picking up criminal clients on the side, mostly meth addicts who were identity thieves who I represented for free or for very little money. In June, one of my criminal law clients got indicted in federal court. I explained to my client I was not admitted in federal court, and the thought of it kind of intimidated me, but he was adamant that he wanted me to represent him. But before I could get all my paperwork together, my client was already assigned an attorney from the CJA panel who showed up at his first appearance. Her name is Michelle Shaw. If you don't know Michelle, she's an exceptionally talented and seasoned criminal defense attorney in Seattle. And when I reached out to her for guidance, she asked me if I thought this was the best case to cut my teeth on in federal court. And when I asked her what she meant, she mentioned there were about 250,000 pages of discovery. Now, I knew at that moment I was in way over my head. Realizing how much better off my client would be with Michelle, I asked her to keep the case, but also asked if I could work with her on the case pro bono. She agreed. In fact, she more than agreed. She actually let me work on the case as a contract attorney and paid me out of her own pocket. That led to even more contract work with Michelle on other cases and a new reliable income stream. And after 5 months of working with Michelle as a contract attorney, her associate left, and I begged Michelle for that job. Now, I know for a fact that a number of criminal defense attorneys approached Michelle at that time and told her not to hire me because of my past. But she did anyway. And suddenly, I was practicing criminal law again full time. I had a lot of relearning to do, and Michelle was there every step of the way to teach me. Had Michelle not taken a chance on me, I would never have ended up where I am today. I worked with Michelle for about 2 years before deciding it was time to create a practice of my own, though not on my own. I still wanted to work for a firm, but I wanted to find some way to combine a family law practice with a criminal law practice. So I started interviewing with a variety of family law practitioners to see if I could make that happen. By now, things were looking up. With all my speaking engagements on addiction and recovery, along with my articles' publication and republication in magazines and on websites, my AVO score crept up to a 7.7, very good, which was very good indeed. I figured with a disbarment on my record, that was probably as high as it was ever going to get, but I was totally okay with that. And now, when you Googled my name, the same negative stories came up, but they were equally diluted with links to my articles, speaking engagements, and bios on different websites. Now, interviewing was still a very awkward experience. I had a lot to explain when talking to someone about hiring me full-time as an attorney. But by this point, I had perfected a short speech explaining what happened to me and why my past was actually an asset and not a liability. Now, everyone trying to overcome a stigma and looking for a job needs to prepare a speech like that. In fact, it's the first thing you should do before you even start looking for work, because you already know it's going to come up the interview and you need to be ready for it. I gave that speech at the first 2 family law jobs I interviewed for, and it worked really well. The third job I interviewed for was with Molly Kenny and her law partner, Tatiana Giderimsky. And I'll never forget one particular part of that interview when Molly turned to me and said, "So, Wil, tell us about yourself." I started my canned speech explaining how a complex series of life experiences can actually be an asset for a lawyer instead of a liability, when Molly cut me off and told me, "We read your article when it came out a year ago, and we approached you about a job because of your past, not despite it. In fact, if you work for us, we're going to put a link to your Northwest Lawyer article in your bio on our website. We want our clients to know what you've been through." That's another one of those moments in your life that you never forget. And of course, I took the job. Now, Molly's not just a great family law attorney. She's also a great businesswoman who really knows the value of a good online reputation. And rather than allowing me to be content with my 7.7 AVO rating, Molly hired me a business coach named Irene Leonard to help me get to the next level in my career. Working with Irene helped me in many ways. First, she taught me a lot about the basics of best billing practices and time management. And she also convinced me that I could write a short book I'd been thinking of for a long time to help parents of boys accused of sex offenses. Without Irene, I would never have written that book. The book's entitled "When Your Son is Accused of a Sex Offense in Washington State, A Guide for Parents." You can download it for free from our website, mollybkenny.com, or on Kindle. Please do so, and please pass it along to anybody you think it might help, because the stigma of being a teenage sex offender is just about the worst one I can think of. Irene also helped me find a better work-life balance so I wouldn't burn out, and in the process, she made me a better lawyer, a better employee, and a better husband. And once my book was finished, I posted it on my AVO profile, and my AVO score jumped from a 7.7 very good to a 9.6 superb, which is where it is today. And true to her word, Molly put a link to my article on my bio right on our website. She's the first lawyer I've worked for who did something like that for me. In fact, she's the first lawyer I've worked for who has encouraged me to talk to my clients about my past. And I'm more grateful for that than almost anything else. It's amazing how well sharing my story with clients has worked out for me. The clients love it, and so far it's been a great way to bond with them. And once you bond with your client, they're much more likely to take your advice and follow your directions. And, I've noticed, they're much more likely to pay their bill. I'm sure someday I'll have a client who reacts badly when I tell them my story, but so far that day has not come. Quite the opposite. It's been a huge asset for me. If you're suffering from a stigma, I hope you find a way to make it an asset for you. It's not impossible. It's not even improbable, provided you get the help you need when you need it most. And that means asking for help. And I know sometimes that's the hardest thing to do, but trust me, it can make all the difference. I'm living proof. If I can take the weaknesses from my past, repackage them, and turn them into strengths, then you can too. But always remember, I didn't do it alone. You need to ask for help along the way. And if you think asking for help makes you look weak or stupid or incompetent, just flip that narrative in your head and tell yourself, asking for help is a good idea because it demonstrates high levels of insight and humility, both admirable qualities everybody should want a lot of. Sell it to yourself that way, or any other way you can. Just ask for help along the way. You'll be glad you did. That concludes my presentation, and now we're going to go over our instant poll results.
Thank you, Wil. So I'm not sure if you'll be able to see them, so I'll read them out loud for you. So we had, everyone else can see them online. We just can't see them in the room right now. I apologize. So I'm reading them out for you. 0.2% said being openly gay. 36% said having a felony record. 19.3% said having spent time in prison. 16.3 having a history of meth addiction. 24.4 having been disbarred and reinstated. And 3.9 for having an AVO rating of 4.4 out of 10.
Okay, that's kind of what I expected. So, Yeah, I think having the felony record is probably the biggest obstacle.
And then
being disbarred.
Yep,
Yeah,
exactly.
those were two big ones to get over. Do we have time for any questions?
Yeah, we have a minute or so. I had a clarifying question about the slide about the statistics. I think when you said 20%, was that including both alcohol and drugs?
It is. It includes all addiction-related issues, but it runs at about twice the percentage as the general population. Lawyers are twice at risk, 1 in 5. Look at any 5 lawyers, chances are one of them is struggling now with an addiction issue or has in the past.
Great. And then somebody was inquiring, do you tell or inform your clients, I think you talked about this a little bit, about your felony prison history, especially criminal ones, to perhaps better connect with them?
Yeah, with the criminal clients, it works great because, I think for very obvious reasons, you can actually identify on a very personal level with what they're going through. When I can tell them, look, I know what's happening now. You've been arrested. There's like a siren going off in the back of your head all the time as you worry about how this is going to affect the rest of your life. Being able to describe emotions like that when you talk to them bonds them to you very closely. For my family law clients, I usually make a passing reference to them about my past, and then I refer them to my bio page on our website and tell them that they can read my whole story. So far, they've all read it, and they've all had some pretty incredible feedback. It's been a very positive experience.